Hi, I'm Hull History Nerd, and on today's episode of the History of Cottingham Snickets, we're going to be looking at the Snicket that slices across Arlington Avenue, Kingtree Avenue, and comes out on Newgate Street, just opposite what would have been the site of one of Cottingham's great houses, Church Lane. So most people who live in Cottingham know about Church Walk, which is the little short snicket that runs around St Mary's Church, leaving Hallgate just near the primary school in the village and coming back onto Hallgate just a little bit further on. It doesn't get you particularly far, but it is a very pleasant walk between the church hall and the old school and the graveyard of the church itself. But what really interests us isn't necessarily Church Walk itself, because that is a fairly well-established route. What interests us is what lies in this little shoulder at the southern corner of the walk, this Snicket, which by itself simply looks like a cut-through to Arlington Avenue. But it's actually the start of what used to be a long, uninterrupted pathway that has a great deal to do with the story of two of Cottingham's great houses. So if you look at this Snicket on the map, you'll see that it's got an unusual shape. It's almost shaped like a sickle. It's got a short straight handle at the bottom where it meets Newgate Street, and then it curves wildly to the side. And it's tempting, if you've grown up thinking that Snickets are nothing more than the gaps between houses, to think, oh well, that's just the gaps that were left between the houses that were built. That must have just been the shape. But no, you'd be wrong, because this curve is actually considerably older than the houses around it. Older by about 200 years, in fact, because these houses are fairly recent. And the reason that this Snicket has this curved shape is because it used to be part of an ornamental garden. Now, before the gardens were built, this lane used to cut straight across in a straight line from Newgate Street all the way across to the church. But in the 1750s, a man called Samuel Johnson, not the man who made the dictionary, that was a different Samuel Johnson, built a house called Kingtree House. And this, all of this, Kingtree Avenue and Arlington Avenue, was his garden. And as part of that garden, he built an ornamental lake. A lake that was supposed to be designed to mimic the flow and shape of a river. And the path was changed from a straight line into a curve so that it could follow the line of this river. Now, this ornamental lake didn't even last that long. I mean, if you look at the Ordnance Survey maps of the 19th century, it's already gone within about 60, 70 years of its birth. But the shape of it is still echoed in the shape of this Snicket. Now, at this point, it's probably worth having a look at the idea of the Georgian Great House. You see, the 18th century was a time of burgeoning wealth for the middle classes, and there were a couple of reasons for that. There were farmers and merchants who'd grown wealthy off the back of the agrarian revolution and enclosure, and there were also a class of wealthy industrialists who were capitalising on the early successes of the Industrial Revolution. And one of the ways in which these people wanted to make their mark on the world was to follow in the footsteps of what they saw as their betters, the lords, the gentry, the people who owned massive mansions in the country with vast landscaped gardens. Now, most of them couldn't afford that kind of opulence, but what they did do was to move into nearby villages to live the country life and build a massive great Georgian house. And that's what they did. and Cottingham itself is littered with examples of these great 18th century houses. Even though we've lost some of them, like Kingtree House and Cottingham House, others remain as statements of the wealth of the person who built them. And an extremely popular place in Cottingham for these people to show their extraordinary wealth, the place to be seen as it were, was the stretch of road leading from Thwaite Street through to Newgate Street and onto South Street. That whole area is littered with great examples of these buildings, and indeed later Victorian and early 20th century ones too. And another trend that was very popular in the 18th century amongst these landed middle classes and indeed amongst the gentry was the idea of the landscaped garden. Now, this craze wasn't started by Capability Brown, but he certainly did his part to popularise it, being responsible for over 170 parks and gardens. He also looked not entirely unlike Eric Idle, but that's not really important now. And when Samuel Johnson was building Kingtree House and buying vast swathes of land to build his garden on, you could be certain that this trend was certainly not far from his mind as a method of expressing his enormous wealth. But the land that had been part of Kingtree House's gardens was piecemeal sold off to developers and became housing developments: Arlington Avenue, Carisbrooke and Carrington Avenue, and of course Kingtree Avenue. But the Snicket was still whole as recently as the 1940s, and the reason for that was because on this side of it was still the wall that separated the grounds of Kingtree House from the rest of the development. In fact, in the 1940s, Kingtree Avenue and Arlington Avenue actually ended at the Snicket. This used to run along the bottom of those streets. And it wasn't until the 1950s that Kingtree House was finally sold off, broken up, demolished, and the rest of the land finally developed. And Kingtree Avenue and Arlington Avenue extended on into this new development here, finally cutting this Snicket into three parts, the way it is today. So as we head further south along Church Lane, we come across this incredible part of it that's bounded by these two really old brick walls. Now, I'm not an expert, but these walls certainly look older than 20th century, and they could just be 20th century walls that are in really bad condition, but I don't think so. I think these are 19th century, which would put it about right for the housing development that was going on along Newgate Street at that time. They're absolutely brilliant. Absolutely love this stretch of it. Claustrophobic in a strange Victorian way. And as we finally get to the end of this tunnel of brick, we emerge blinking into the sunlight here on Newgate Street. Not that far from the centre of the village, and almost directly opposite what would have been one of the great houses of Cottingham, Cottingham House, in fact. And this mansion would have been built sometime in the 1750s or 1760s, but sadly it was demolished in the 1970s. And in its place now stands a retirement home called the Laureates, just across the road there. But there is something left of Cottingham House. And indeed, it does seem to be almost a continuation of Church Lane, although it isn't. Let's have a look. So this is Longmans Lane. Now, whilst Cottingham House may have had its grand entrance fronting onto Newgate Street, it also had a side entrance, and this is it. Or at least it used to be. And this would basically start from Newgate Street, almost exactly opposite the Snicket, and travel all the way down here towards the stable block. Now, you might think that this might be a continuation of an older path that went from the church out into these fields towards the old farms, and you probably wouldn't be wrong. It's entirely possible that this would have spread out to all the different farmsteads that dotted this whole area. But the only evidence we've got these days is that it went down here as far as the stable block of Cottingham House. And interestingly, that stable block is the only part of Cottingham House that still exists to this day. And here it is, just at the end there. Now, it was actually converted into a farmstead in the early years of the 20th century. In fact, Longmans Lane gains its actual name from the family who owned this dairy farmstead back in the 1920s, the Longmans. So historically, this would have been where Longmans Lane ended. But the story doesn't finish here, because in the 1960s, a housing development along Link Road actually made the Snicket extend further in order to create a cut through for residents from the centre of the estate through to the centre of village without having to go fairly out the way to the east or west to get there. And this is a Snicket in the much more conventional sense, in that it was quite literally laid out in the gap between some houses and a small playing field. But it built upon a much older and more historic Snicket. Church Lane, a historic Snicket that used to cut all the way across the town to the church, and which was bent out of shape 270 years ago to fit round an ornamental lake, and which stubbornly reshaped the housing developments that grew around it in Arlington Avenue and Kingtree Avenue. And even now, 270 years later, it still has that same distinctive curved shape it was forced into. It's a fantastic piece of Cottingham's deeper history, one that's hidden in plain sight that you probably walk past every day without even thinking about it. Or hopefully now you will. Hopefully you'll join me for the next episode, where I'll be looking at Bacongarth and walking in the footsteps of some very, very ancient medieval monks.